Who would win? One city with extreme historical significance, or some flamey boys? I'm Jamie's Day, your favourite day of the week, and this is the Great Fire of London. So welcome to the channel everyone, where today I'll tell you the magical story of the Great Fire of London. But before I do tell you this magical story, please do leave a like on the video if you do enjoy the content, and if you haven't yet, please do subscribe. It really does help the channel grow, which is exactly what this fire done when it started spreading, grew rapidly. Our story today begins in London. It's the year 1666, it's the 2nd of September, and it's a Sunday evening shortly after midnight. Everyone is sleeping soundly, but there's some trouble brewing. Down Pudding Lane, at the King's Bakery, all the fires have been extinguished except one. This one fire that hasn't been extinguished sets off a spark, and this spark is enough to destroy roughly 90% of London's housing. So how did we get to this point where one spark destroys a whole city? Let's find out. By the 1660s, London was by far the biggest city in Britain, being home to roughly 500,000 people. An English writer, John Evelyn, compared London to the magnificent Paris and called it wooden, northern and inartificial congestion of houses, and also expressed about the fire hazards posed by the wooden congestion. The buildings were made of timber, covered in a flammable substance called pitch, and roofed with thatch. They were tightly packed together with little regard for planning, and the city was essentially medieval in its street plan. It was overcrowded, a warren of narrow, winding, cobbled alleys, and it experienced several major fires before 1666, with most recent being in 1632. The homes were typical 6 to 7 storey timbered London houses and all had jetties, which were with the projecting upper floors. They were all but touching the upper storey, and they were so close you could even shake your neighbour's hand. Lots of animals also lived in London, so as well as the houses, the city was full of sheds and had yards packed with highly flammable straw and hay. Following a long dry summer, the city was suffering a drought. Water was extremely scarce and the buildings were extremely dry. This was a recipe for disaster. The year prior, in 1665, London had survived the Great Plague epidemic, and the survivors of that probably thought it couldn't get any worse. It could. Now, as previously mentioned, a fire broke out at Thomas Farriner's Bakery in Pudding Lane a little after midnight on Sunday the 2nd of September. Just before we continue that, can I say, what a great street name for a bakery, Pudding Lane. It's so fitting, it's so fitting. Anyway, the family was trapped upstairs, but managed to climb from an upstairs window to the house next door, except for a maidservant who was too frightened to try, and she became the first victim. The neighbours tried to help douse the fire, and after an hour, the parish constables arrived and judged that the adjoining houses had better be demolished to prevent further spread of the fire. The owners of these houses protested, and the Lord Mayor, Sir Thomas Bloodworth, was summoned to give his permission. When Bloodworth arrived, the flames were consuming the adjoining houses and creeping towards the warehouses and flammable stores on the riverfront. The more experienced firemen were clamouring for their demolition, but Bloodworth refused on the grounds that most premises were rented and the owners could not be found. Bloodworth is generally thought to have been appointed to the office of Lord Mayor as a yes man, rather than possessing the requisite capabilities for the job. Lord Bloodworth panicked in the face of an emergency, and when pressed for an answer about the fire, came up with an extremely iconic line: "Pish, a woman could piss it out," and then he left. What a man. The fire soon took hold. 300 houses quickly collapsed, and the strong east wind spread the flames further, jumping from house to house with the fire sweeping through the warren of streets. There was no official fire brigade back then, and people were using fire hooks to pull the burning straw from the houses, water squirts to try and extinguish the fire, and buckets of water were being passed to person from the River Thames in an attempt to quell the flames. However, this wasn't that effective. Eyewitness Samuel Pepys wrote in his diary about the events: "Everybody endeavouring to remove their goods and flinging into the river or bringing them into lighters that lay off. Poor people staying in their houses as long as till the very fire touched them, and then running into boats or clambering from one pair of stairs by the waterside to another." The king was informed about the fire and sent word to the Lord Mayor to spare no houses, but to pull down every house in order to create a fire break. When Bloodworth was found to deliver this message, he was trying to coordinate the firefighting efforts and near to collapse, like a fainting woman, and in response to the king's message that he was meant to pull down the houses, "But the fire overtakes us faster than we can do it," he refused the offer and went to bed. Samuel Pepys later writes in his diary about Lord Bloodworth, "People do all over the world cry out for the simplicity of my Lord Mayor in general, and more particularly in this business of the fire, laying it all upon him." So basically, he was blamed for the fire. King Charles arrived soon after to see the houses not being pulled down and ordered a whole demolition of the houses west of the fire zone. By Sunday afternoon, 18 hours after the alarm was raised in Pudding Lane, the fire had become a raging firestorm that created its own weather. By Monday, the fire spread to the north, reached the financial heart of the city. The houses of the bankers in Lombard Street began to burn on Monday afternoon, prompting a rush to rescue their stacks of gold coins before they melted. Suspicion soon arose around the panicked city that the fires were being started on purpose. Because of the swirling winds, sparks and flames flew meters and meters away from the main fire, starting seemingly unrelated fires on new buildings, which gave the illusion to people that people were starting these fires on purpose. Foreigners were immediately suspected because of the ongoing Second Anglo-Dutch War. Fear and suspicion hardened into certainty on Monday, as reports circulated of imminent invasion and of foreign undercover agents seen casting fireballs into houses or caught with hand grenades or matches. There was a wave of street violence that followed, and also religious alarms of renewed gunpowder plots. The panic caused less efforts into fighting a fire, and now instead rounding up the suspicious foreigners or rescuing them from mobs. People were desperate to remove their belongings, and this was an opportunity for people to make money in the chaos. The day before the fire on Saturday, hiring a car had cost a couple of shillings, with a shilling being about 5 pence. On Monday, it had rose to as much as £40, which was a fortune equivalent to more than £4,000 in 2005. Every boat and car owner who could seemingly get to London came to make some money off this, and the chaos at the city gates caused the magistrates to close them, in the hopes that the inhabitants were less focused on their valuables and more focused on fighting the fire. Monday was also the start of more organised action against the fire. The King's brother James, the Duke of York, was now put in charge of the operation, setting up command posts around the fire's perimeter and organising any lower class men he could find into teams of firemen. The King himself had also been seen joining the firefighters at this point, passing buckets of water to them in an attempt to quell the flames, but the fire raged on. Tuesday saw the greatest destruction for the fire. A lot of refugees were in St Paul's Cathedral, and it had been crammed with lots of goods as it was seen as a safe place due to its thick stone walls and wide empty surrounding plaza. However, the cathedral was undergoing restoration works at this time, and the wooden scaffolding around it caught fire Tuesday night, and within half an hour the lead roof began to melt and the cathedral was quickly a ruin. The fire was still moving east against the prevailing easterly winds towards the Tower of London and its gunpowder stores. The garrison of the tower had waited all day for relief from James's fire teams, but they took matters into their own hands in the evening, blowing up a large amount of houses with gunpowder in order to create a fire block and stop the advance of the fire. By Wednesday, the fire had started to fade as the fire breaks created with the gunpowder began to have an effect. The wind had also dropped off since Tuesday evening, and the fires were beginning to burn themselves out on their own, and the Great Fire was finally over. Samuel Pepys writes in the aftermath, "The saddest sight of desolation that I ever saw." Remarkably, only 6 people were recorded to have died in the fire, but the damage was estimated to be roughly £10 million, or in today's money, 1.9 billion. In the aftermath, fears of foreign terrorists and of a French-Dutch invasion were as high as ever among the traumatised fire victims. A poor demented French watchmaker called Lucky Hubert confessed to starting the fire deliberately. Hubert was convicted, despite some misgivings about his fitness to plead, and hanged. After his death, it became apparent that he had been on board a ship in the North Sea and had not arrived in London until 2 days after the fire had started. Although the Great Fire was a catastrophe, it did cleanse the city. The overcrowded and disease-ridden streets were destroyed and a new London emerged. The Great Plague epidemic of 1665 is believed to have killed a sixth of London's population, or 80,000 people. And it is sometimes suggested that the fire saved lives in the long run by burning down so much unsanitary housing with their rats and their fleas, which transmitted the plague, as plague epidemics did not recur in London after this fire. A monument was erected in Pudding Lane on the spot where the fire began, and can be seen today, where it is a reminder of those terrible days in September 1666. Sir Christopher Wren was given the task of rebuilding London, and his masterpiece, St Paul's Cathedral, was started in 1675 and completed in 1711. In memory of Sir Christopher, there is an inscription in the cathedral which reads, "Si monumentum requiris circumspice, if you seek his monument, look round. I've probably butchered that Latin. Wren also rebuilt 52 of the city churches, and his work turned the City of London into the city we recognise today. The map shown on screen now is said to be a reproduction of the original, which shows Sir Christopher Wren's plans for reconstructing the city following the Great Fire. Note on the lower left hand side there's an image of Thamesis, the river god after who the River Thames is named, and in the upper left hand side is a mythical phoenix which suggests that London would too rise from the ashes. So there wraps up our story of the Great Fire of London. Thank you all for listening, and I hope you all enjoyed. I've been Jamie's Day, your favourite day of the week, and this was the Great Fire of London. I'll see you all next time. Peace.